Hi all, happy Thursday. I hope you guys have had a good week. I hope everything e-learning wise is going well. Before we go on to what we're doing today and why I have this guy behind me as the background, I want to go over what's going to happen next week, at least Monday next week. So I think that this is going to be our last topic of new material for Africa. I think after today, I'm going to go on to something else that is a little more, not more interesting, but like something I want to go over for a while and something we've asked about that we haven't had a chance to. And I thought now would be a good time to kind of incorporate that in where we have a little extra time. So this will probably be the last new material for Africa. So that means I think on Tuesday we are going to do a short kind of wrap up quiz over the stuff we've been doing the last 2 weeks. It won't be anything super long, 10 questions, probably multiple choice on Canvas, open note, what have you. I think Tuesday, I'm gonna try and see if we can do a Quizlet review over this through Zoom. I don't know if it'll work or not, but I want to try it, see if it will. So if you would like to be a part of it on Monday at 10 when we do our normal meetings, I will try and do a Quizlet live review game over this. It may not work, and if that's the case, I will have the Quizlet uploaded to Canvas for you guys to access and all, and then the assignment for Monday will just be the kind of wrap up quiz, and then Thursday next week we'll go on to new material. So I mentioned last time we talked about how they had the Boer Wars and how afterwards South Africa became its own country and was eventually the white European population became the leading party. And as a result of that, we have this system that has come to be known as apartheid. And we're going to look at what that is and why it's relevant to everyone in world history, not just us. It'll also help explain why this guy is on my background screen. So apartheid is racial segregation and how the people in South Africa, the black majority, responded to this system with nonviolent means. So hopefully before this is all over, you will be able to tell me these four things. You'll be able to tell me what apartheid is. You'll tell me how it came to be. Describe what actions were taken by the majority. So like what actions did the black Africans in South Africa take? Were they violent, nonviolent? How did they respond to this? And then you'll be able to tell me some important individuals in this movement. The big one is Nelson Mandela, which is the guy behind me. And he is probably, outside of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, one of the most well-known and respected nonviolent leaders of the 20th century. So apartheid is just, the word itself is Afrikaans, meaning apartness. So it literally means apartness or separate. And it was a policy of separation based simply on skin color. Nothing else mattered. It was solely decided based on your skin color. It was largely put into place after World War II in 1948 when the Afrikaans National Party, which was largely a white party, was elected to power and began putting laws into place that were very obviously to stack against the majority African population. Um, Eventually, at its height, these laws would restrict just about every aspect of one's life: who you could go see, where you could go, how long you could stay there, what jobs you could have, what jobs you couldn't have, who you could marry, even things that today, at least in the United States, we look at and like, the government should not be able to tell us what we can or can't do in these aspects. These laws did just that to the Africans. They did not largely apply to the white population. The white population, which was largely European, largely Dutch, British, these laws did not apply specifically to them. So essentially, this system separated the country into two different sections until its end in 1994, when, due to internal and kind of international pressure, the government got rid of some of these laws. So it almost, in a sense, if you look at the sign here, it literally is certain things were meant for certain groups. So like this public premise system, they meant the things inside it were just for white people. Black Africans did not have access to wherever this sign was. They could not enter there for any reason unless they were accompanied by a white person who had given them permission to be there. So how did all of this even happen? So it went back to just after South Africa gained its independence with the passage of what's known as the Land Act. And what that essentially did was force the native Africans to move to certain parts of the country and live on reserves, essentially reservations that were designated by the white government. These often were areas of very poor, lacked basic health services. By the 1950s, the government had taken this step further. They had banned interracial marriage. And then eventually, with the Population Registration Act of 1950, had divided the population into four groups. The whites being at the top, Indians in the second, and then mixed people, colored as they were known as there. So mixed race individuals, and then Bantu or Black Africans. So this system is very similar, if you remember, to the caste system we talked about in India, where the higher up you were on this system, the better access to things you had. This applies here, in a sense. If you're a white person in South Africa at this time, you're doing all right. If you are a Bantu or a Black African, this system was absolutely miserable. You did not want to be a part of this, but you largely didn't have a choice. The system put in place was very restrictive as far as what you could or could not do. So, what actions did these people take? So, a lot of the actions taken here were nonviolent, which in and of itself is amazing that these people, in the face of all of the issues they had going on, were able to do this in a nonviolent way. That's kind of helped their cause in the long run. They largely participated in nonviolent means. They would stage nonviolent protests, sit-ins, and a lot of times they would purposely break laws in front of police with the hopes of being arrested. They thought if enough of them got arrested at once, it would break the system. That didn't actually happen the way they thought it would, but over time, its effects became clear. A lot of times, the government responded violently to these protests. They became brutal and oppressive. Often, the government would resort to violence. So the government was attacking its own people who were not armed to put down these protests against the system of apartheid. One of the most well-known instances of this, and the picture on the PowerPoint screen, is actually what is known as a massacre at Sharpsville. And this actually happened in March of 1960, I believe. And a large group of Africans had gathered outside the local police station in Sharpsville to protest what is known as the passbook law. And what that was Black Africans had to have a passbook stating where they were going, how long they would be there. It had to be signed by the person they were going to see and approved by the police. This system, these passbooks were absolutely hated. by the local Black Africans. They hated this system, and so they gathered in front of the local police station in protest, hoping they would be arrested for breaking this law. Instead, what ends up happening is the government, the police, end up firing into the crowd, and between 67 and 70 Black Africans were killed on the spot, and another 180 were wounded for participating in this protest, this nonviolent protest. The picture on the background of the PowerPoint is actually a well-known picture of this event. If you notice, you can't really see the police in the background, but everybody is running away from the violence, but the police are shooting into the backs of unarmed Native people. This did not sit well with the international community. In fact, the International Olympic Committee actually banned South Africa from participating in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. They refused to allow South Africa to send a delegation because South Africa had said that only white athletes would be representing the country. And so the Olympic Committee said, you are not welcome to bring your delegation to the Olympics. And then as time went on, more and more countries began economically boycotting South Africa, which essentially means they refused to trade in any capacity, militarily, economic, whatever. They refused to do business with South Africa until they addressed this system of apartheid. Even the United States eventually began boycotting South Africa in the mid to late 80s, I believe. So for a while, the United States refused to do any official government business with South Africa, and even outlawed their private companies from doing business in South Africa because of the system of apartheid. So why is this guy on my background screen? So things began to change in the late 80s and early 90s due to the international pressure, the boycotts, the diplomatic tension. The government actually began relaxing some of the apartheid laws. And so they eventually, as part of this, released a bunch of people from prison who had been arrested for participating in some of these nonviolent protests. This guy here, his name is Nelson Mandela, and he is one of those people who had been imprisoned for his participation in these protests. He had actually been arrested in the early 1960s, and he had actually been sentenced to life in prison. So he spent almost 30 years of his life in prison for his participation in these nonviolent protests. And so as part of this deal to loosen these restrictions, the government released Mandela from prison in the early 1990s, and he actually ran for president. And he was actually elected to be the first Black African president of South Africa. And soon after he was elected, he called for a new constitution in South Africa to formally eliminate the system of apartheid in the country. And that constitution was actually signed officially into law on the spot where the Sharpsville massacre had occurred roughly 30 years prior. So Nelson Mandela is one of the most prominent nonviolent protesters of the 20th century. His stance on it, his arrest, his time in prison, and then his subsequent election to the presidency of the country, and then the creation of the new constitution actually earned him the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in removing and changing this system. So, for the assignment today, it's in Canvas under the module for Thursday, April 16th. If you took notes, rewatch the video, look over the PowerPoint, whatever you need to do. The assignment is actually going to be an Ed Puzzle video. that actually goes into some of the more details of apartheid and how it came about and how it ended. So if you, that should be the assignment for today. If you haven't heard, the school is having teachers do office hours on Tuesdays and Fridays going forward. For me, my office hours will be here on Zoom from 12:30 to 1:30 on Friday and Tuesday, and I will send out the meeting information sometime today so you guys will have access to it. Again, those are always optional. It's if you have questions you want to ask via Zoom, that's the time that we're setting aside for you guys to do that. If you don't have any other questions, then you are free to do whatever else you need to do for other classes. If that's the case, hopefully I will see you guys on Monday or Friday. Have a good weekend.